Je veux en profiter pour remercier ceux qui nous permettent d'être ici, qui sont bien sûr Patrimoine canadien, le Power Corp, le Secrétariat aux relations canadiennes et Johnson & Johnson. Without our sponsors, we would not be here. And I'm also going to invite the chair of our board, the chair of the Action Canada board, Aisha Malek, who is also going to give you a little bit of context and explain what is this program and who are these people and why are they here today presenting to you?
Good morning, everyone. Mon nom est Aisha Malek. Je suis une ancienne du programme de 2015 et j'ai l'honneur de servir comme la présidente, the chair, du Conseil d'administration d'Action Canada, the chair of the board of Action Canada alumni. As Action Canada entered its 20th year, can you believe that already? It continues to be one of the most important leadership and public policy development fellowships in Canada. Every year, we select a competitive cohort of young Canadians who are leaders in their own communities, who have demonstrated impact where they work and in files that they work on, and have shown a passion for public policy, who want to take their work to the next level, to come be a part of this fellowship for a year. Lots of you are here as supporters of those folks. Thank you for supporting them in taking on this additional burden in already very busy lives and parts of busy careers. We take a close eye in selecting these leaders through a number of diversity lenses, including to being very impressive individuals. Of course, we're trying to get some regional diversity, some rural regional rural fellows. It's really early, as well as some fellows coming from bigger cities. We're looking at gender diversity. We want to make sure that we're bringing together a group of Canadians that can have a very interesting, diverse, and powerful dialogue, right? Bringing their own perspectives to a discussion so that we can come to solutions collectively. Over the course of the year, these fellows are benefiting from mentorship, from capacity building, from experiential learning by visiting different communities around the country, and personal development training as well, in order to help them launch into whatever they want to accomplish next. Nous avons sans doute un groupe très, très impressionnant cette année. Vous les connaissez, vous les rencontrez, et j'ai hâte de voir ce qu'ils vont nous présenter aujourd'hui. Fellows have gone on to have really impressive careers. Some of them are impacting policy, they're advocating for policy every day. They are launching new organizations, they are running and winning seats in office. Action Canada's Fellows network continues to grow, and our alumni continue to impress us every single day. If you know someone who could benefit from a program like this, just a PSA that the application time is still open, and we would love to have more fellows join our network. As part of the Action Canada Alumni Program, it is my responsibility to lead this network and to help grow it. So I'm happy to welcome you for the first time, and I'll do more of that this evening at your graduation ceremony. But today's presentation is a culmination of a year's worth of work, of research, of dialogue, of interviews with experts, of teamwork, on engaging people in communities to learn, to dialogue, and to debate, and to discuss. In my year, I know that some of the folks that I spoke to in the context of developing our project, I still have their voices in my head as I do my day-to-day work with the federal government. I hear them and I think about how what we are doing every day is going to have impact on them. And so I hope that that is the experience that you've all had. I look forward to seeing what you are going to present to us. I'm sure maybe many of you feel the same way that I do, that the product is important, but how you did it is even more important. So looking forward to seeing what you're presenting today. I'd be remiss if I didn't end by saying a huge thank you to Sarah Christine and to the Public Policy Forum for continuing to run a really impressive program, and of course to our sponsors as well. Thank you so much for continuing to support Action Canada.
Passons à comment ça va se passer aujourd'hui et aux présentations. Nous allons avoir 3 présentations en ordre, 10 minutes chacune, et ensuite une courte période de questions. So there will be 5 minutes for questions after each presentation. For some immediate burning questions, for those of you who are joining us virtually, please share your questions in the chat and we will read them out loud. But the most important thing is to have a discussion, to have a dialogue. We want to hear from you. Also, the fellows want to hear your thoughts and discuss the reports with you. So after the presentations, we will have breakout discussions virtuellement et en personne, and we'll give you some instructions at that point for how to divide. You'll be able to choose which group you join, which conversation you join based on your interests. So with that, I would like to invite up group one for their presentation.
All right, hi everyone. It's always fun to go first, so we're really happy to be here. Hi to everyone joining us virtually. So my name is Leslie Munoz, and I'm really pleased to introduce a really excellent team that I had to work with this year, our team. We have Elisa Moladina, we have Jesse Gill, Trevor Tessier, Emily Soulier, and Scott Stewart right over here. This is, like I said, a really fantastic group of people. We have public servants, we have a doctor, we have expertise in banking, in entrepreneurship, and in nonprofit leadership. So really, really great group here. In tackling this year's Action Canada theme of housing, we decided to focus in on the intersection between housing and climate change, two of the most pressing challenges facing Canadians today. In particular, we focused on extreme heat and tackling some of the challenges that it presents for vulnerable Canadians living in community housing, especially for those living in urban settings. I'll now pass it over to Lisa.
To start, we want to bring you back to one of the most deadly climate-related events in Canada's history, the 2021 BC heat dome, where 619 people lost their lives in a single week. 98% of deaths occurred inside people's homes, and many of those who died were socially isolated or from low-income neighborhoods. But behind these stories, behind these numbers are real people and real stories. Like Jan Gould, age 71, who died while waiting 90 minutes for an ambulance, despite living 10 minutes from a hospital. Or Annie Moret, a young mother who struggled to keep her 2-month-old son Wade alive as her apartment temperature rose to over 36 degrees Celsius. Canada is warming at approximately twice the global rate, and extreme heat events are likely to become more severe and more frequent. And it's not just BC. Between 2050 and 2080, cities like Ottawa, Winnipeg, and Edmonton are likely to experience 4 times as many days with over 30 degrees Celsius temperatures. Extreme heat disproportionately affects the most marginalized members of our society, and community housing tenants are one of the most vulnerable as they lack the resources to adapt to rising temperatures. It's essential we all come together and act now to save lives before it's too late.
Sorry, a little trade-off. So to make sure we're all on the same page when we're talking about community housing, we're talking about housing that is either owned and operated by nonprofit housing providers, housing cooperatives, or housing that is owned by provincial, territorial, or municipal governments. And in terms of why we chose urban areas, an overwhelming majority of Canadians live in urban areas, and they tend to be warmer than surrounding rural areas. And as Elisa mentioned, the tenants that are living in community housing are extremely vulnerable to extreme heat. And there's just not a lot of policy research on how to protect these people from extreme heat as our climate changes. And in coming to our recommendations, we did our own research, but we also interviewed 44 different experts and stakeholders across the country. And we learned that the issue is more than just AC. And so we decided to focus not just on individual building retrofits, but policy interventions. And so in total, we came to 4 main recommendations. The first is coordinated heat response plans. Second, we need to adjust our government programs and policies. Third, we need to reduce urban heat through land use and urban design practices. And finally, we need to generate more private investment to support climate resilient community housing. And we really believe that through our recommendations, we can support the federal government's goals and the national national adaptation strategy to really promote human health and well-being through climate adaptation. And with that, I'll pass it over to Trevor to take you through our very first recommendation.
Thanks, Jesse. This is a direct quote from a BC paramedic who responded to real people like Jeanne Gold and Annie Moret. The paramedic said, once they reach the ambulance, that means they have not reached any of the other safety nets, or worse, nobody found them and we find a fatality. In response, we recommend the creation of coordinated heat response plans to protect community housing tenants from extreme heat. Partnering with public health to establish baseline data and understanding community vulnerability allows communities to create actionable solutions, such as targeted check-ins to assist in preventing death. The BC Coroner Report panel recognized there is the need for provincial coordination for extreme heat, as extreme heat is a provincial emergency. In response, we recommend adding heat-related illness to syndromic surveillance. What this means is that when a patient shows up to the clinic, the emergency, or calls public health, they have their location identified and tracked. Why? So we can understand the spread and severity of illness to create a multi-jurisdictional approach to preventing death. Emily?
Notre deuxième recommandation est pour le gouvernement de prioriser explicitement l'adaptation climatique dans ses politiques, programmes et règlements, particulièrement en ce qui a trait à la chaleur extrême. Durant la vague de chaleur en 2021 en Colombie-Britannique, le prédicteur principal de décès était la température intérieure et non les caractéristiques individuelles des personnes. Nous recommandons donc qu'une température intérieure maximale soit établie et introduite dans les lois provinciales et les règlements municipaux afin de protéger les locataires des logements communautaires et au gouvernement fédéral d'émettre des lignes directrices claires pour supporter cet effort. En ne tenant pas compte de la nécessité d'adapter nos logements communautaires aux changements climatiques, nos codes du bâtiment canadien sont désuets. En incorporant, nous recommandons d'incorporer les normes de refroidissement actif et passif éco-énergétique dans la prochaine édition du Code national du bâtiment. Enfin, pour réduire les îlots de chaleur dans les quartiers à faible revenu et pour promouvoir l'équité environnementale, nous recommandons un modèle d'attribution des fonds spécifiques au logement communautaire dans le cadre du programme fédéral 2 milliards d'arbres. Je cède la parole à Leslie.
Perfect. So our third recommendation lends itself quite well to the recommendation that Emily just talked about the 2 billion trees program. Our third recommendation is all about green solutions to reduce the urban heat island effect and to ensure communities have the infrastructure necessary to respond to extreme heat events when they do occur. To start, we recommend that municipalities set urban tree canopy coverage goals while prioritizing tree planting efforts near community housing. As well, green retrofits are very, very important. Things like green roofs reduce temperatures indoors. And the science behind these types of interventions is simple. Trees produce shade, they also transpire. They actually release water vapor throughout the day, and that water vapor has the capacity to reduce temperatures at a city block level scale. There's one study that demonstrates that trees actually have the capacity to reduce temperatures up to 60 meters above the ground. And for perspective, that's the equivalent of about a 20-story building. Our third sub-recommendation under this one is all about complete communities. Walkable communities that are well connected to public transit reduce heat waste from vehicles. They also have robust community amenities. They have schools, they have daycares, they have rec centers and community centers, and those can all double as cooling centers when there are extreme heat events. I think back to the story that Elisa shared with us at the beginning about the mom who really struggled to keep her infants comfortable during the heat wave in Vancouver. I wonder if the situation might have played out a little differently for her if she had access to a cooling center near her home. Now, we know that these interventions are going to take time. Trees don't grow in a day, and neither do complete communities. But these are important land use and urban design decisions that we must take seriously and we must incorporate into our policymaking, especially as Canada continues to warm. I'll now pass it over to Scott.
Thank you, Leslie. We know how to build housing that protects residents from the impacts of extreme heat. The challenge for policymakers is on how to catalyze the sufficient funding to support this critical work. Les décideurs politiques doivent faciliter l'augmentation du capital financier privé pour soutenir le développement des logements communautaires afin de protéger les résidents contre la chaleur extrême. One of our recommendations is for municipal bonds to become tax exempt. In doing so, municipal bonds will become more attractive to private investors, and therefore, municipalities will be able to borrow more money, which they can then invest in building more climate resilient community housing. Another one of our recommendations is for community housing agencies to work more with energy service companies, otherwise known as ESCOs. ESCOs finance retrofits through creating energy savings. A community housing agency can conduct retrofits through working with an ESCO, and in doing so, it means that they can do critical retrofit projects through incurring minimal direct upfront expenses. A great example of a retrofit program or an ESCO program worth scaling is the Toronto Atmospheric Fund's Retrofit Accelerator Programming, which is doing fantastic work across the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, doing things like putting in heat pumps that both generate energy savings as well as help protect people from the impact of extreme heat. Thank you very much, and I will now hand it over to Emily.
Merci. Chaque été, nous assistons à la dévastation humaine et écologique que engendre la chaleur extrême. Il est crucial de comprendre que la chaleur extrême est un enjeu immédiat et non seulement un enjeu auquel nous ferons face dans le futur. Pour cette raison, nous lançons un appel urgent à l'action et à la collaboration aux décideurs politiques afin d'assurer que cet enjeu soit reconnu et priorisé avant la prochaine vague de chaleur.
Merci beaucoup. We are excited to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. We're also taking questions virtually.
For the green roof, are there particular species of trees that we should be looking at?
So we didn't get into the technical details of that, but of course, native species that are grow in Canada and are native here, that's the way to go.
I know you focus specifically on urban, but I'd love to just ask you to think on your feet a bit and take some recommendations to a rural setting as well. Is there anything you think that could kind of translate into a rural setting?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. The question was that we focused on urban. How can we translate our research or policy recommendation to rural? So I'll talk to the health ones specifically first. All the health ones, just like the BC Coroner Report panel recognized, it's a provincial emergency. This is a natural disaster. Extreme heat is not getting the focus that it needs. And when we consider rural and urban, we need both of them involved in creating coordinated heat response plans and also responding to that heat. But I'll turn it over.
Maybe we'll take the next question. Is there one from online?
I do have a question from online. So Shoshana Sachs is asking, how quickly do you feel that your different recommendations could be rolled out? What are the time horizons?
Definitely. So for some of the ones that we put out there, developing heat response plans, that's something that could be coordinated. If someone really wanted to prioritize it, that could be done in a year. Things like setting a maximum indoor temperature, that's also kind of an easy win. It would be a matter of putting it through a legislative process or through the bylaw process at a municipality. Things like trees, things like complete communities, those are obviously more mid to long-term goals. And then in terms of the innovative financing solutions, that exists out there. We just need to increase the capacity. We need more people to take that type of work on.
I just want to add something on as well. I completely agree with everything Leslie said. I think it's also important that we recognize the upfront investment as well as the maintenance. So trees require maintenance, targeted check-ins. These are all ongoing programs that, yes, they'll require an upfront investment, but we need to make sure that they are sustaining their long term, because extreme heat is only going to get worse. And I think we all need to come together to ensure the most vulnerable are protected. And part of this is that will make it sustainable, that will make it long-term, is ensuring we start now to build partnerships. Instead of working in silos, we really bring together a lot of the active players in making this possible.
I guess next question. I see one right there.
Bonjour, une question en français, si je peux me permettre. Vous avez commencé en parlant d'un critère lié à la température dans le logement. Je me demandais s'il y avait, en termes de population, des populations plus fragiles, peut-être les personnes âgées, et si vous aviez réfléchi à des solutions qui sont spécifiques pour certains types de populations.
Merci Annie pour ta question. Effectivement, les populations plus âgées, les populations qui vivent avec des maladies chroniques, tous ceux qui vivent dans le fond dans les logements communautaires, ils n'ont pas les ressources qu'il faut pour eux-mêmes se protéger de la chaleur. Donc, c'est pour ça qu'on a décidé de mettre le focus vraiment sur les locataires des logements communautaires parce qu'ils sont naturellement plus vulnérables puis ils ont besoin du support, notamment des gouvernements, pour mettre en place justement des choses comme des températures intérieures maximales. Puis si on n'est pas prêt à introduire des lois comme ça, des règles comme ça à travers les pays, ben une bonne façon de commencer, excuse-moi, c'est de vraiment faire prioriser les logements communautaires.
Just going to add something as well. So I'm going to speak in English, because no one wants to hear my French. I think you're welcome my French. I just wanted to also mention that we need to think about certain challenges that certain populations face. So what if there's a power outage? What if the individual who has cognitive and physical disability can't get to the cooling center? Who's checking in on them? So I think when, when we're thinking about who is affected, individuals with chronic medical conditions, elderly, individuals with disability, we also need to think about what are the challenges that they are facing in reaching safety. I know, when I was reading, the BC Coroner report, the thought of individuals passing away in their homes from a largely preventable illness is truly heartbreaking. So I just wanted to mention that, we need to be targeted in our solutions and recognizing what are the challenges certain populations are facing and what are potential things that can happen that they can't reach safety nets in developing our solutions.
I could add to that, but
You can take that. One more question. Go ahead.
I was just you touched on it a bit already about why you focused on community housing, but I know, as well, I'm sure we'll probably learn in the next report, there's like a real shortage of that. So I'd imagine a lot of vulnerable populations are still living in non-community housing rental situations. And it seems like a lot of the policies that you've outlined could apply to them as well, but there'd probably be different challenges and limitations between those. I don't know if you could speak to that, or like why you chose to focus on one, if a lot of the things could be applied, but maybe those different challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic question. And first off, to say that many of the recommendations in the report, for instance, the recommendations related to urban heat islands and urban design, definitely are applicable to non-community housing residents as well. So it's to say this report, I think, is relevant to a broader audience. But to answer your question specifically, why did we focus on community housing? I think two predominant reasons. The first is that the residents of community housing are disproportionately vulnerable as it relates to extreme heat. And for instance, in the BC heat dome, a higher percent, like around 10% of the residents lived in, or 10% of the folks who died in the BC heat dome lived in community housing. So we decided to focus on community housing because it is a particularly vulnerable group, and it's where we feel a significant impact can be made. The second area that's important to note is that in terms of the pre-existing research on this field, is that there's no report that has been done previously on how to specifically help the residents of community housing as it relates to extreme heat. So we thought this was a novel research question and something that addresses a real gap that exists in Canada.
I'll ask one more question from the chat and then we'll go to the next group. Hasna in the chat asks, the focus of your policy recommendation is access to cooling centers, location detection, etc. How about the central cooling and other options from the comfort of their homes?
Yeah, this is something that came up a lot in our report, and it's probably one of the most controversial questions in this issue of like mandatory kind of air conditioning, of which there's lots of pros and cons. One of the cons of mandatory air conditioning is around climate mitigation. Like in essence, if you're trying to adapt to climate change, but you're using all of this energy on air conditioning, how is that potentially exacerbating the problem? In essence, our kind of stance on the air conditioning or the kind of cooling issue is kind of multifaceted. I think it's a case-by-case situation. For a vulnerable population that can't leave their homes, then access to cooling absolutely makes sense. But in other situations, just putting AC units in all buildings potentially isn't the most prudent option. And one thing that we definitely talked a lot about as a team is to go beyond air conditioning and to look at heat pumps. And to recognize that heat pumps are potentially a more environmentally friendly, more energy efficient way to provide cooling in homes. So we could speak for a lot. It's a very complicated issue, but it's to say that providing cooling in homes is an important part of the solution, but you have to weigh the pros and cons that exist.
And the only thing I would add to Scott's response is that air conditioning increases the cost of electricity bills, and this can disproportionately impact the residents that already have a very tight budget. So we don't want to put the burden of AC on the tenants. So there's this question as well when we talk about introducing air conditioning, who's going to pay the bill? So that's why technologies like heat pumps, but there's really a lot of other technologies, and there's also a lot of passive technologies that we can implement that would not put a burden on the finances of tenants of community housing.
I think that's a great place to end. So. The clicker? And I'd like to invite up team 2.
Is it okay if I try?
Yep.
Messed it up.
It's your stage.
Just before we begin, we want to welcome those of you who are joining us online. And if you could, if you haven't already, please turn on your camera. We're going to start with something a little interactive and would love to have you involved. Bienvenue. Before we dive in, by a quick show of hands, I'd like to ask you, have you ever been a renter before? Your entire life? Okay, almost all the hands went up. Now keep your hand up if you're still a renter today. Okay, about half the hands went down. Now, finally, keep your hand up if in the last year, you have been forced to move rental accommodation. See, maybe just one hand here, and I'm looking online, a couple online, so not many. And yet, for 1 in 3 Canadians, home belongs to someone else. With all the turbulence, scarcity in the housing market in the last few years, that's a lot of people who are living without a safety net. It happened to me one summer living in Toronto. I couldn't afford rent. So I lived in my van. And one night I came home and poof, my van was gone. All that I saw was an empty parking space. And I've never felt fear like that before because I didn't know where to go, what to do. But that was just one night in my life. And for far too many Canadians, this is their everyday. And we, the policymakers in this room, watching from home, we need to be able to relate. Action Canada nous a donné l'occasion de sortir de cette salle de conférence, de rencontrer des locataires à travers le pays et d'écouter leurs histoires. We met Robin and Victoria, who last year was evicted illegally from her home. And worse, her landlord coerced her into signing away her rights so that she could post the same apartment online for $700 more. We met Nathaniel, a student in Brampton, who along with his 2 roommates, they were co-renting the same bed, sleeping in 8-hour shifts. We met Neha, a newcomer in Halifax, who on her second night in Canada, the landlord threatened and forced her to the street. Today, I'm a homeowner, and I stopped renting 2 years ago because I became a dad. I wanted to help provide more safety and stability for my family, but in doing so, we actually pushed a family of renters out, those that have been living in the home previously. And I'm uncomfortable with the fact that we're disproportionately benefiting as housing prices soar while renters are getting cast aside. And hearing the stories as we did across the country this year made me really question, why is our legislation, even outside of housing, so biased toward ownership? It made me open my eyes to the plight of renters and the precarity that they face today. And we believe that the power has shifted too far and that balance needs to be restored.
Thank you, Ben. The dream we all may have been sold decades ago, the one of Robin, Nathaniel, and Neha, does not match the experiences of those renting across the country, or maybe your own experiences renting. Pour beaucoup d'entre nous, la location est notre seule option, not merely a step towards homeownership. This is why immediate interventions are needed today to help tenants across the country, and that is why we are presenting 4 recommendations. First and foremost, and we all know it, we must increase supply. Most of our current purpose-built rental stock dates back to the 1960s, where there was federal programming to support the development of purpose-built rentals. But since then, that was 50 years ago, and right now we are currently sitting one of the lowest vacancy rates for purpose-built rentals in 20 years. And the rates for the secondary rental market are just as grim. Robin, Nathaniel, and Neha need options now. So we must build more rentals, but to do so, we must work with for-profit and nonprofit developers, each requiring unique policy solutions. For-profit developers need tax incentives to deduct construction and maintenance costs from their taxable income and from their bills. Nonprofit developers, financing is needed for construction, but also through non-repayable grants or forgivable loans, which would later be recuperated through tenant rents over the lifespan of the build. But beyond building more housing, the acquisition of units can actually be faster and to help preserve existing stock. Dedicated funds with pre-approval mechanism should be established to establish nonprofit developers to access funds for bidding quickly, particularly for those serving groups most impacted by unaffordability. Cities could also introduce the right of first refusal bylaws, as Montreal has, enabling governments and nonprofit developers to bid quickly to access affordable rental units for those in need.
Construire les logements, c'est bien beau, mais c'est pas assez. Il faut aussi les construire plus rapidement. Neha can wait for new rentals. The newcomers need new rental units today. and therefore we must accelerate these development processes. C'est pourquoi on s'est inspiré de la ville de Victoria, de l'État d'Oregon et de la Nouvelle-Zélande pour vous présenter 2 actions concrètes afin d'accélérer les processus de développement. D'abord, pour les projets qui s'associent déjà aux exigences de construction, il faut accorder les permis de construction plus rapidement, voire immédiatement. In the city of Victoria, for example, if a project aligns with community plans and meets design criteria, it is allowed and moved forward immediately without any additional hurdles. Deuxièmement, comme le font la Nouvelle-Zélande et l'État de Oregon, il faut aussi adopter des règlements de surzonage afin d'encourager la densification et la diversification des types de logements. Avec des règlements de surzonage, on pourra densifier sans être gêné par la bureaucratie. Requirements for inclusionary zoning, for example, can also help set aside number of new housing units to be more accessible for people living on low incomes. Avec ces recommandations, on pourra construire des logements plus rapidement afin de combler la demande actuelle. Mais construire des logements, c'est bien beau, mais ce n'est pas assez. Il faut aussi encourager et permettre aux locataires de vivre de façon plus pérenne et sécuritaire. C'est pourquoi on recommande de mieux redistribuer les impôts. The intent here is to address the economic drivers favoring home ownership bias and the financialization of the rental market. Et en plus, cette recommandation permet au gouvernement d'augmenter ses sommes de revenus et de réinvestir cette somme dans les communautés afin de supporter de nouveaux projets de construction. Plus précisément, on recommande 3 réformes fiscales portant sur 1. L'impôt sur les gains en capital, 2. L'impôt sur la propriété et la valeur foncière, et 3. L'imposition sur le loyer imputé.
Currently, property taxes are applied to the value of the property. This discourages landlords from improving their rentals for fear of increased property taxes. However, by providing 2 levers to tax property and land value could encourage better land use around community services. We also found that it was relevant to address the growing financialization of the rental market. To address this, many interviewees recommended reforming capital gains tax. However, any changes to capital gains must be done with caution given its broader economic impact. For this reason, we recommend appointing a panel of experts to study this option in more detail in order to assess those unintended impacts. Finally, as more and more people are unable to access homeownership, we recommend taxing imputed rent. But what is imputed rent? Housing contributes to Canada's GDP through rent. This calculation even accounts for houses owned by homeowners, which are referred to as imputed rent. We currently don't tax imputed rent, but we could, which would further reduce the wealth gap between homeowners and renters. It is currently economically preferable to aspire towards homeownership rather than renting right now. However, these 3 tax recommendations really seek to offer and promote renting as a long-term viable option for all Canadians.
The next step is to enable renters' voices to be heard and their needs prioritized in housing data and decision-making. We heard that NIMBY, or not in my backyard sentiments, can block affordable housing projects and push renters further to the margins. The development of community plans is a prime time to engage renters envisioning what inclusive neighborhoods could look like, and there's innovative work happening in Burnaby and Toronto to do this. We also struggled to find data that could tell an accurate picture of the rental market, particularly the secondary rental market. Rental data should be open, accessible, and comparable to allow for better assessment of need and land for development. We also recommend the establishment of a rental registry that could enable transparency of pricing over time and of landlords, and a reevaluation of the definition of housing affordability to better reflect the cost of living. Finally, renters deserve security of tenure that carefully balances the need for maintenance of rental housing. Policy in this area should ensure that renovations are necessary, should enable a renter's first right to return, and should ensure that there is ample eviction notice provided if eviction is found to be necessary. Renting might be far from your reality for many in the room. It's not my reality anymore. And yet, there are people in my community and in yours, the person at the grocery checkout counter, maybe a newcomer colleague, maybe a kid who is. And the reality is that their ability to access an affordable rental in the places that they want to live, contribute, and thrive is uncertain at best or impossible at worst. We have an opportunity to break free from a pattern of thinking and policymaking that maintains home ownership as the only option at the end of the housing continuum. Our report and the accompanying pop-up book invite you to use your imagination to picture what might Canada look like if renting was a more affordable, stable, and secure option for Canadians. Might our communities be stronger? Might our future be a little bit brighter? How can we make this a reality? Thank you.
As a first generation Canadian, you know, I became a homeowner and then a landlord because I was always taught that intergenerational wealth was accumulated through property. And so what is a good way to, or what are your recommendations around how to engage landlords in this discussion? Because I've ultimately become now with my mortgage rates, a not-for-profit renter, a landlord. We're not really making any money with the way we're going. So what are your recommendations about how to engage the landlords as part of this conversation?
Can you repeat the question? Yeah, so Aisha's question is, how can we better engage landlords in some of the policy changes that might need to happen to equalize the playing field here? And I think something we talked about a lot as a group is not wanting to pit homeowners and renters against each other. We're all part of the same communities. We all deserve a safe place to live. And it is a reality that people are relying more and more on the ownership of property to create financial stability. I think one of the things that we want to make sure is that we're not disincentivizing the ability to own a secondary home for the purposes of renting, but we also want to make sure that we're not seeing single homes owned by, or homes owned by lots of different people. One person owning many different homes may not be the solution.
Yeah, just to build on that too, I think municipalities can really support landlords in updating bylaws to allow for maybe secondary suites that would contribute to the rental market while also supporting landlords in that intergenerational wealth.
And I can add another point. We are not recommending for people to just completely go into rentals, right? Like, and even if we want people to live better in rental conditions, we still need landlords to support them. Our recommendations are affecting more, for example, how the stock that is needed and people who might be going too far and exploiting the renters to a certain extent. And those are more the bad actors that we're trying to address, not because we really do need renters, landlords to have renters altogether.
I sense that this is one of these topics in the Canadian zeitgeist that everyone walks in with a lot of opinions and assumptions. And I'm curious for you all as a team, if you could share a story of how through your relationships with one another, whether there's many cups of coffee or really vigorous debate, that one of your opinions really changed, or one of your assumptions was the story.
Can you repeat the question?
So the question was, through conversations with our task force, but also those we met with kind of across the country, what assumptions were maybe challenged or biases that we had that we kind of changed over the course of the year? I might start and then pass it. For me, one of my assumptions was that developers are bad guys, and they're eating up all of the market housing, and they're really kind of carving out this space that other people feel entirely excluded from. And meeting with developers from across the country, there was really sincere desire to contribute to the housing continuum in a broad way. and ways that, we're maybe building non-market housing within market developments, recognizing that not every renter necessarily needs affordable housing. They're happy to live in market rentals, freeing up that space. So having that conversation with developers, seeing partnerships between municipalities and developers in successful ways is really interesting. And that's definitely a perspective of mine that has been since change.
I can share something that really surprised me. In doing our research, I was astounded, as Deanna says, it's easy to think, well, it's the big bad developers, or it's this, that, or the other thing, what's the evil corporation kind of trying to get us? I come from business, but I was surprised that in some provinces, more than 40% of the entire residential stock of homes and apartments is actually owned by individuals who own multiple properties. Right? And that actually adds up collectively, even though each single actor is kind of buying an additional investment condo for themselves and not thinking they're contributing on their own to the problem, right? Collectively, it's shaping and impacting society much more than any one company, right? And so that's a great example where policy at a macro level needs to kind of consider the impact of many who aren't necessarily acting negatively one at a time, but who collectively are having a big impact, and to figure out ways to shift the levers to kind of get the outcomes we want.
I'm going to go to a question from the chat that builds on this. So St. Matthew's House asks, you said it's important we're not disincentivizing the ability for people to own a second home for the purposes of renting. Why?
So one thing, this sort of actually is a great question. It does connect, and it connects to what I was going to respond to. I think something we learned through this research is that the non-market housing stock in Canada, so this is owned by nonprofits, cooperatives, land trusts, represents between 4 and 6% of all housing in Canada. So 4 to 6%. In countries like Austria, Switzerland, some European countries, that proportion is more like 30 to 40%. So there's a much more balanced market in terms of the guaranteed affordable and market. And it allows for there to be a little more, competition isn't quite the right word, but more of a balanced approach to the way that rents tend to be. We're at 4 to 6%. To get to 30 or 40 is a big goal, a big change, and it's not something that's going to happen immediately. And so we believe a balanced approach to being able to add more non-market rentals to the housing stock overall, while also recognizing the important role that the secondary rental market plays right now, is the approach we chose to take.
I can also tie that in with a former question. I think, like Deanna, I think we all have these prejudices of these, developers or bad guys or even landlords, right? But I think it's more, I think it comes back to the first question. Not everyone has malicious intents, and not everyone is exploiting the people that they serve. And I think it's really being more precise and trying to address the real issues instead of a larger population. And here with renters and landlords, we recognize that we need more landlords, and we need different types of landlords, right? Like the non-market players. And there are different ways to kind of, incentivize those outcomes.
Great. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Over the past decade, we've seen how our city's landscapes have changed and transformed. Tents or encampments have become ever pervasive. And with this pervasiveness, we've been faced with what to do about them. A question seemingly everyone has had an opinion on, but many have chosen to avoid. Well, the courts haven't, and they've recently weighed in a really big way. In Kitchener-Waterloo, a judge has ruled that clearing encampments is a charter violation if adequate indoor shelter spaces are unavailable. They have a right to shelter themselves. And so this has widespread implications for cities that have been clearing encampments as a default reaction, and has gotten a lot of people talking and talking and talking. And so this is not a problem that it's not a problem that are just going to go away. This is something that Canadians and Canada have to address together. This is not a problem we can just walk by and ignore. This is something that municipalities have been facing almost alone. And we need to create a coordinated response to alleviate this pan-Canadian concern. My name is Zakaria, and our team, Catherine, Sarah, Naheda, Jasmine, and Ian, have been studying encampments. And we have a few solutions we really believe in. But before that, I'm going to let Ian set some context.
Donc, voici quelques chiffres. En 2020, un tiers des Canadiens connaissent une personne qui a été itinérante. Et le coût de l'itinérance au Canada pour l'économie canadienne s'élève à plus de 7 milliards de dollars par an. En 2022, 58% des Canadiens pensent que l'itinérance est un problème dans leur collectivité. Donc, les campements sont un échec visible des politiques et un enjeu de santé publique. Mais comment y répondre? C'est une question difficile pour équilibrer les droits individuels et collectifs. Comme Zachary l'a dit, les décisions rendues par les tribunaux montrent qu'on ne peut pas faire expulser des gens sans leur offrir d'autres alternatives pour se loger. Donc, il y a des décisions importantes à prendre concernant les niveaux de tolérance et d'intervention pour déterminer comment réagir. Ma collègue Jazz va lui parler de certaines villes.
Thanks, Ian. So encampments are impacting communities of all different sizes all across the country. Just one of these communities is Kingston, a few hours down the highway from where I'm speaking to you today in Ottawa. And Kingston's not really a big city, but they've been called on to confront some big city challenges, like a spike in urban homelessness and a rise of several large encampments. I went and I spoke to people living in one of Kingston's largest encampments just a few weeks ago. One woman, Kelly, shared with me the challenges of living rough, living outside, and particularly the challenges of being a parent to her daughter, who's 14, who was also living in the encampment. I spoke to another young man in his early 20s who had been there for a while. He'd been kicked out of his aunt's house, in part because he had a substance use disorder, but also he thinks because he's transgender. And the encampment had become a home of sorts, but he also says that he lives in fear of violence or harassment every day. These were just two people out of dozens who were living in this one encampment in Kingston, outside in the winter. And Kingston is just one community of many across Canada who are being asked to address encampments without the amenities or resources or supports that they need to help people find safer places to live. When we were doing research for this report and having conversations, these same tensions and same themes came up over and over again. We saw them in Vancouver, where encampments are not necessarily a new issue, but are an increasingly challenging issue. Encampments are becoming larger and more established and entrenched and more dangerous in places like Crab Park. Those themes came up in places like Moncton, which was the largest, fastest growing community in Canada last year, but has also seen homelessness double in the last few years. It is so abundantly clear that a lack of action on a national level is creating real harms at a community and individual level. It's taxing the already scarce resources of local governments and community services. It's further straining and damaging the relationship between local homeowners, business owners, and their unhoused neighbors. And it's creating irreparable harms and even endangering the lives of the most vulnerable Canadians.
Donc, merci Jazz. Dans notre rapport, nous soulignons que chaque niveau de gouvernement exerce des responsabilités qui se chevauchent. Les municipalités jouent un rôle important et immédiat dans la lutte contre les campements grâce à leur rôle dans l'application des règlements, la gestion des parcs, la santé et la sécurité publique. Cependant, les autres niveaux du gouvernement ont aussi leur rôle à jouer. Il s'agit notamment des responsabilités des provinces et territoires en matière de santé et services sociaux, ainsi que du rôle du gouvernement fédéral dans le financement du logement. Donc, nos recommandations montrent l'importance de la collaboration au sein et entre les différents niveaux du gouvernement. Naheda et Sarah vont nous présenter nos recommandations.
Insufficient financial capacity and limited resources have left municipalities struggling to respond to a rise in encampments and the emerging challenges that come as a cause of this rise. Our first recommendation asks for an increase in funding from provincial and federal governments to support municipalities to provide affordable housing. We know and we see that the traditional shelter system does not work. This increase in funding will allow for innovative solutions to be introduced, such as modular housing and teeny homes. Good policy requires good data. The Auditor General has identified a lack of collection and coordination of homeless data as a top priority. Nous recommandons donc que le gouvernement fédéral établisse des procédures claires pour la collecte et la diffusion de données. Ces procédures devraient inclure de la collecte de données propres à chaque membre. The lack of protocols and guidelines that often municipalities do not have means that municipalities are responding to encampments irrationally at times. Our next recommendation asks for municipalities to produce protocols and guidelines that outline encampment response and also take into account the community, the resources, and the importance of coordinating effects. Providing services such as sanitation, food, and wraparound services in encampments has earned strong responses, both from politicians and the general public. Some feel providing services in encampments institutionalizes these encampments. Others feel it is a basic recognition of the human dignity of those in encampments. Our view, following significant debate over the last year, is that where encampments have already been firmly established, such services should be provided in order to reduce the impact on those in the encampments, but particularly in the surrounding community. Donc, nous recommandons que les villes facilitent l'accès des résidences de campement aux services tout en continuant d'encourager une transition vers les refuges. Oftentimes, when municipalities are responding to encampments, they're responding without having conversations with the service providers and without having any coordination in their response. Our next recommendation asks for the formation of a pan-Canadian task force that would allow for different agents and different stakeholders to come together and share knowledge and best practices. Laws which fine homeless or incarcerate homeless individuals for doing what they need to survive simply do not work. Instead, they further place those in homelessness into further poverty, making it more difficult to come out of this situation. Nous recommandons que le gouvernement abolisse le règlement qui punisse de façon disproportionnée les personnes. In our final recommendation, we see that communities are having conversations, and these conversations are often heated and polarized when it comes to encampments and the response it entails. Our final recommendation asks for a dedicated fund that would allow for information campaigns and dialogue forums, public dialogue forums to take place from municipalities from coast to coast. Next, we'll hand it over to Catherine.
Merci, Naëda et Sarah. Comme vous avez pu le constater dans notre présentation, les campements sont un enjeu croissant partout au Canada et il est urgent d'y répondre. Ils sont malheureusement une conséquence des difficultés grandissantes que rencontrent les Canadiens pour trouver du logement abordable et adéquat. Ils sont aussi le symptôme de l'échec de politiques relatives au logement, à l'itinérance, aux dépendances et à la santé mentale. Les villes se chargent au quotidien de répondre aux campements. Ils posent à leur communauté des défis urgents en matière de sécurité publique et de cohabitation. Ces municipalités ont besoin de support, de fonds publics et de meilleures données. Les autres paliers de gouvernement doivent s'y intéresser et s'y investir. En conclusion, nous sommes tous d'accord, les campements ne devraient pas exister. We all agree, encampments should not exist. Pour un jour atteindre l'objectif de 0 campement partout au pays, il est essentiel que tous les niveaux de gouvernement collaborent. Oui, ça exige du leadership politique, mais aussi la participation d'individus de tous les horizons. L'urgence est là, les défis sont gigantesques, nous devons tous répondre à l'appel et travailler ensemble pour trouver des solutions. The urgency is there, the challenges are enormous, we must all answer the call and work together to find a solution. Thank you. We'd love to answer any questions that folks have. At the very back. Go for it.
All right. So I live in LA. Arguably had one of the worst unhoused problems.
We can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I live in LA.
Yes.
Which is arguably had one of the most, at least politicized unhoused problems in the United States. And one of the biggest challenges that we find is that, and the biggest for NIMBYism, right, out of my backyard. And the issue is that a lot of people, they don't want to see them housed, but they don't also want to feel solutions in their own community. They kind of want to set out of mind. So how do you gain? I wanted you to discuss strategies in terms of how to win the public on side. I mean, arguably the last mayoral race in LA was on in-house problem, and it was a big issue of discussion, and just want to see if you have discuss
that. I think so. I've been between Vancouver and Seattle as well over the past year, and so again, the west coast of the United States and the west coast of Canada has had a real problem with encampments and the politicization of them around the issue. I think one of our recommendations around like the government stepping in, we haven't really had a consistent voice, especially in the Canadian context, where we have a plan, a pan-Canadian plan that can address things. And so we feel like that can tone down some of the tensions that are currently going on. The NIMBYism in this specific case is very evident, but at the same time, these folks are still there, right? They're evident, they're clear. I live when I'm in Seattle, I'm in Chinatown, and right there's a really big encampment, and there's always problems in terms of folks like interacting with them and things of other nature. And I really feel it's not a problem that if we don't address, they're going to disappear. These people are not going anywhere. If they're leaving your city, they're going to another city, they're going to another place. And these people are also not encampment residents. They are Canadians, they are Americans that are experiencing homelessness, that are experiencing chronic homelessness. So we feel as though as Canada and as a government, if we really try to address this holistically, specifically with the information piece that my colleague mentioned, we feel like there can become a bit of a bridging of that gap between people that are unhoused and folks that are housed.
I really appreciate this topic because I do work in the homelessness and incarceration cycle. Something I'm curious about is the amount of homeless people in Canada is about 0.6% of the population, but with the highest need. Could you think of any recommendations or improvements to the democratic process in Canada where 0.6% of the population that faces the highest need can actually better achieve the outcomes that are required for them, where they are limited in number and also limited in actual power, from whether it's money, political power, whatever the case may be.
Okay, so I'm going to repeat the question to make sure I've understood. So you're saying about 0.6% of Canadians are experiencing homelessness, I'm assuming at any given year, maybe in any given time. So how can we shape our processes, our democracy and our government to ensure that we actually are being responsive to people who don't often have a voice? I think that's a really tough question. It's a good question. I'll start and I'll hand it over. I think one really important piece is that not just in terms of democracy and expression, but also our services and systems are not well tailored to people who are experiencing homelessness. I was talking with some other fellows yesterday
Zach and I were talking to some people who were living in an encampment in Toronto, and there was a man who was talking about that he was on parole and he was having a hard time actually getting to use services because he was in the system. He had been in a shelter, and the shelter had bed bugs and cockroaches, and he had left. But because he no longer could give his shelter address as his address, he was violating the terms of his parole. So essentially, by virtue of not having a fixed address, he had been fully shoved out of the systems and safety nets that were designed to ostensibly help him reintegrate, especially post-incarceration. So I think there needs to be a greater flexibility and consideration given to the circumstances of people experiencing homelessness, especially when it comes to our bureaucratic systems and our services, to ensure that people don't fall between the cracks because they're experiencing homelessness.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we need to remember around this issue is that it's a charter rights issue, and that's fundamental to Canadian democracy. The courts have constantly been asked to weigh in around the dismantling of encampments and Section 7 rights, the right to life, liberty, and freedom of person. And the courts have generally come down on the side of encampment residents within reason. And so when we talk about this issue, it's not only an issue of how are scarce resources being allocated, but it's also, this is very much an issue that's fundamental to Canadian democracy and how we view the rights of all Canadians to pursue the rights that are in that charter. And that's really where this hits the road, because it really is, as Ian referenced in his remarks, a collective rights versus individual rights issue.
One last question. Yeah, numbers and stats are always really tricky. I know that on one of your initial slides, you had $7 billion cost to the economy and approximately 35,000 people at any given time homeless. Unless my math is wrong, that's like 200,000 per person. So motivation to deal with homelessness should be high. But I'm wondering if of those costs to the economy, if there's one or two significant areas where stakeholders might be easily convinced to direct resources towards that problem.
Sure. So first on the numbers, both the $7 billion and the 35,000 is from a report that was written 9 years ago. The 35,000 refers to an each night. This is the number of Canadians experiencing homelessness or some sort of precarious housing. So over the course of the year, it's closer to the 0.6% figure, which is closer to 250,000 Canadians over the course of the year, which then reduces the per individual number on the calculations. But if we look at the impact, particularly in the healthcare system, individuals who don't have a fixed address or somewhere to go home to, who are experiencing really serious medical problems, end up spending a lot more time in hospitals, needing that type of care, follow-up care. This is something, as a group of 17 fellows, we learned a lot about from Eliza, who's in a different task force, but even when we were first getting feedback, she kept saying, think about public health. And I think it's a really important reminder to our group and how we learn from each other over the course of the year. But that's maybe an important place to look at and a valuable place to say, by investing in housing, we're having an impact on healthcare budgets in a really important way that is really looking at how this is then a provincial and federal issue rather than just thinking about what are municipalities doing in response. Thanks.
Okay, great job.